These items were inserted into the vaginas of women who had sexual relations with the devil analytically, on men who performed homosexual acts, and in the mouths of people who blasphemed the church in ancient times. In medieval Europe, women were subjected to tortures that would give you chills when you think about them. Imagine being forced to ride a wooden frame with a sharp ridge on it, or facing the gruesome fate of being sawn in half due to a neighbor's accusation of witchcraft. In this video, we will highlight some of the most terrifying punishments for women. Are you guilty or not? Spanish donkey chapters of history can be cruel and dark, revealing how imagination can turn a pleasurable attraction into suffering. Riding a horse may be enjoyable, but climbing a Spanish donkey's back is a highway to hell. Each movement plunges you deeper into the abyss of discomfort or death, commonly known as the wooden horse. It was first adopted by the Holy Inquisition. Inquisition in France, and later in Germany and Spain, gained significant prominence during the colonial period. It was brutal, as it ensured maximum suffering for the victims by inflicting severe pain on them through the use of torture methods such as dismemberment. The torture device used was constructed in the form of a wooden frame, shaped like a horse, with sharp edges that served as the horse's spine. The device was supported by 4 legs, fixed to a stand that was approximately 6 or 7 feet high, with wheels at the bottom of the legs to allow the device to be rolled across the ground. A head and a tail were attached to the device, giving it the appearance of a wooden horse. The victim would be forced to sit on the wooden horse, sometimes with weights tied to their ankles and their hands bound behind their backs. This caused the sharp edges of the wooden frame to press down painfully, cutting into their bodies and slowly tearing them apart. They were expected to remain in this position for hours, sometimes days, until their ordeal was over. They were exhausted or on the verge of permanent disability due to severe injury, which resulted in severe or permanent damage to the genital area. Most victims would bleed to death while on the wooden horse, and those who survived often succumbed to infections later or were left permanently disabled. It was easy to identify someone who had endured this torture by their walking style, which was forever altered by the brutality they suffered. A victim of the wooden horse could never walk the same again, with a guarantee of genital damage, including ruptured perineum or a broken sacrum, a large triangular bone at the base of the spine. Women who were subjected to this would lose the ability to bear children. However, the wicked intent behind this punishment was nothing compared to the breast ripper, who would rip a woman's breasts. Punishment sounds unthinkable in today's world, but in the Middle Ages, this was considered a legal form of justice. The Iron Maiden, the breast ripper, was one such cruel instrument that makes one wonder how cruel and inhuman the lawmakers of the Middle Ages could be. The Iron Maiden was designed to shred and tear the breasts of women accused of adultery, self-induced abortion, pregnancy outside of marriage, or erotic white magic. A suspect of these crimes was tortured with this heated instrument. Its 4 claws would clamp over her breasts, gripping them firmly. The torturer would then slowly turn and pull the device, leaving her breast tissue completely ripped off. If she survived, her damaged chest would mark her for life. She would never be able to breastfeed her future children. Although this may seem ridiculous in the 19th century, it was common in some regions of France and Germany for unmarried mothers to have their breasts ripped out of their chests. During this period, the breast ripper was a common torture method used for interrogation and punishment. However, in most regions of the world, it was more often used to intimidate the accused into confessing, rather than actually inflicting the torture. The mere fact that such a device was devised reveals the depth of cruelty in medieval society. In terms of sheer brutality, watching the burning of witches is horrifying. Imagine being bound to a stake with flames rising beneath you, for a crime that would seem absurd or laughable today. In medieval times, it didn't take much to be accused of witchcraft, and death by fire was the automatic sentence for those found guilty. While this may seem cruel and horrible, it was generally accepted in the society of the time, often motivated by religious superstition. Witch hunters went about their business, seeking to eradicate any perceived threat to their beliefs. In times of difficulty, such as during outbreaks of disease, communities and regions often looked for supernatural causes. Witches were seen as one such supernatural cause. Anyone who became sick or suffered an unexplainable misfortune might seek a mystical explanation among the people around them. Accusations of witchcraft usually came from within the community, often involving a dispute after which one party suffered some misfortune or illness. People accused of witchcraft confessed under torture, claiming to be guilty. Some also implicated other people, accusing them of being witches as well. While this may seem ridiculous, there was often little or no evidence against those arrested for witchcraft beyond rumors and allegations that were difficult to prove. This made obtaining a confession vital to the trial, but it was difficult to obtain without torture. Under such cruel and horrifying circumstances, what kind of confession could one give? It seems absurd, but it was more terrible than the scolds. The swatch bridle, although today's scolding may seem like a minor issue, was more significant than one might think. In 16th and 17th century England and Scotland, the scold's bridle was a form of punishment for gossips and those deemed too loud. It was specifically designed to address concerns about women who were running out of control, including defying husbands, rioting, and challenging priests. There were common instances in medieval England where victims of the bridle were involved in social protest and dissenting religious movements, which were seen as a threat to the moral and economic well-being of the community. Many of these women were also accused of witchcraft. When the scold bridle was installed, the wearer was led through town to demonstrate that they had committed an offense or been scolded often. This was usually done in order to humiliate them and encourage repentance for their alleged actions. A spike inside the bridle prevented any talking, as any movement of the mouth could cause severe injury. When wearing the device, the person was unable to eat or speak. The goal was not to take lives, but to degrade women in society. The damage caused to their self-esteem was profound, leaving scars more profound than those from the iron. The Iron Chair from Game of Thrones takes viewers on a fantastical journey to claim the Iron Throne, but in medieval times, no one desired the Iron Chair, as it was a symbol of torture and often led to death. Often referred to as the Chinese torture chair, this terrifying device featured hundreds of sharp spikes on the seat back, arms, and legs. Although there were many variations, they typically consisted of around 500 to 1,500 spikes covering the entire chair, with a hole on the seat for placing fire and coal. An 1891 newspaper describes how this device was used to punish criminals, describing the process in detail. The chair was designed to cause death by applying pressure against sharp spikes. The victim was secured in the chair by a front bar and another vertical bar, while two rings held their ankles tightly. If the victim did not cooperate, they were tied down even tighter, causing the spikes to dig deeper into their skin. Underneath the seat, there was a stove with a fire burning. This would slowly roast the victim's lower body parts, causing severe pain and potentially leading to death. This device was used on convicted women and suspects, as it was believed to instill fear and extract confessions. If torture failed to yield desired results, the person themselves could be subjected to the same treatment. The Iron Chair is an example of a medieval device that makes us grateful for the progress we have made as a society. If being subjected to such torture causes fear, imagine how much more severe the punishment would be in the past. The breaking wheel. Imagine being strapped to a massive hamster wheel, left to spin for days, all because of a religious opinion. Sounds like a horror movie, right? But that was the reality for women in medieval times, reserved for the worst criminals. The breaking wheel was designed to inflict maximum pain and suffering, often before a large crowd, popularly known as the Catherine wheel. It crushes the limbs and bones of the condemned, sometimes over the course of several days. Women condemned to this punishment were either broken on the wheel, or broken by the wheel. In the first method, an authorized executioner would drop a wheel on the condemned to break her bones. In the second, the victim is tied to a wheel so that her executioner can systematically break her bones with a cudgel. Afterward, the victim would often be left on the wheel for hours or even days, their broken limbs gruesomely intertwined in the wheel spokes. Needless to say, it frequently took them a long time to recover. Although the breaking wheel was originally reserved for slaves and heretic Christians, it later became a punishment for crimes ranging from treason to murder. This method eventually faded from use in the 19th century, but the horror of it remains as disturbing as the legacy of sawing a woman in half with a chainsaw. Imagine a carpenter sawing through a piece of wood. Now imagine a woman being tied upside down and cut in half in the same way. Although this may seem horrifying, it was the grim fate of some women in the past. For offenses that we would hardly blink at today, the victim was usually hanged upside down and sawed apart vertically through the middle, starting at the groin. In other cases, the condemned person was apparently fastened to one or two boards before sawing. Women convicted of witchcraft, adultery, or black blasphemy were usually victims of this cruel method of torture. The victim was often in a conscious state as the sawing took place. The executioners sawed through the body, cutting them in half. Sometimes, the operation might take hours before they finished. It was a gruesome way to die, extreme and disturbing. As shocking as this may seem, what will truly shock you is the cruelty of the device known as the pear of anguish. The anguish is a rumored torture device developed in 17th century Europe. It combines sexual violation and horrific physical pain, making it one of the most brutal instruments of agony. Commonly known as the choke spear, the pear of anguish was used to extract confessions from criminals. Depending on the nature of the crime, it would be inserted into the mouth, anus, or vagina of the victim, with the intention of inflicting maximum pain and discomfort. For example, those convicted as heretics would have the choke spear inserted in their throat. Homosexuals and witches would have it inserted in their vaginas or anuses, as the case may be. During the torturer would turn the device, causing immense suffering. This device was a symbol of extreme cruelty and was used for extracting confessions and punishing those who were considered to be enemies of society. The head of the anguish device expands as it presses against the walls of the victim's rectum or vagina. The pressure begins to build, and the victim feels as if the metal will tear through the sensitive nerve endings, resulting in unending agony. The anguish device stands as a chilling reminder of the lengths that humanity has gone to in the name of punishment and control, especially towards women. I would not wish such a horrific experience on my worst enemy. What is more chilling is the punishment of stoning to death. Stoning to death, although it may sound ridiculous, is one of the oldest forms of execution in the world, and by all measures, it is certainly among the most barbaric forms of punishment. Sentences were announced in public, and their implementation was made known in good time, so that everyone could come and witness the victim's death. If convicted, a deep, narrow hole is dug. The woman is then tied to her neck and inserted into the ground up to her head, exposing only her head. Members of the public and public executioners throw rocks at her until she dies. Although this method of execution is common in some parts of the Muslim world, it actually originated with the ancient Jews, who practiced death by stoning as a punishment for adultery. However, the Jews abandoned this practice in the 1st century. The victims are usually women. Oftentimes these women are innocent but falsely accused of adultery by husbands who want to get rid of them. The idea behind this method is to bury the victim under a pile of stones, as the small stones build up around the victim's body. The crowd shifts to throwing larger stones until they are dead. Unfortunately, 15 countries still practice this method of punishment. Stoning to death may sound like the highest form of brutality, but the psychological effect is on par with other forms of punishment. The Republican marriage. The term Republican marriage may sound lovely, but it is a horrific way to end one's life. During the Reign of Terror in the French Revolution, Republican marriage was one of the most brutal forms of punishment inflicted on women. It left one to ponder the depths of human cruelty and wickedness, as it involved death by drowning. Upon fully submerging a victim underwater, the process of drowning begins, and it is a race against time for survival. Typically, a Republican marriage involved tying a naked man and woman together, and then drowning them in the Lier River in France. These marriages involved pairing individuals of different genders, often an older man and older woman, or a younger man and younger woman, who were stripped of all clothing, and letting them sink to the bottom of the water. The outbreak of cholera and typhoid in French prisons during this period led to the adoption of this cruel method of execution. It was devised by French revolutionary Jean-Baptiste. Thiers was credited with introducing this form of execution, in which he was responsible for quelling counter-revolutionary activities and establishing a revolutionary committee. Although it initially began as a night event in an effort to hide what was happening from other prisoners and the people, Jean-Baptiste Thiers decided that was not good enough. He ordered Republican weddings to occur during the day as a way to deter anyone who was not dying of disease or imprisoned from doing anything that would put them in jail. This was a brutal period marked by extreme measures meant to suppress any opposition to the revolution. The Republican marriages stand out as one of the many atrocities, reminding us of the darker moments in history. Unsettling and horrifying. What would you think about foot binding? Although throughout history, women have suffered pain and agony in the name of beauty, few practices can match the agony and lasting impact of foot binding. Foot binding is an ancient Chinese custom of wrapping young girls' feet tightly in strips of cloth in order to restrict their future growth. This practice has been popular in China for centuries and is believed to have originated in the early 10th century. Originally, it was a symbol of status among elites, but soon spread to all social classes, affecting millions of women and girls throughout the millennium. Small feet were highly desirable among men in China. The shape and pain caused by bound feet made women walk with a unique gait, which many men found attractive. Lotus shoes, specially designed to highlight the small size and shape of bound feet, became a prized fashion accessory. The binding process begins with soaking the girl's foot in a mixture of animal blood and herbs to soften the skin and bones. Next, the toes are curled under the foot, causing all toe bones to break. The foot continues to be bound until the desired size is achieved. To be bent until the arch of the foot also broke, cotton bandages were wrapped around the foot to keep the broken bones in place. The bandages had to be unwrapped at least every other day in order to clean the foot and check for infection. Then, they were re-wrapped even more tightly. The broken bones usually did not heal for several years, and when they finally did, they were prone to breaking again later in life. Though this form of torture may seem unimaginable today, it highlights the extreme measures society has frequently taken in the pursuit of beauty. Foot binding is severe, and the boundaries of cruelty cannot go any further than female circumcision. Circumcision, as surprising as it may seem, continues to be practiced by many people worldwide. The World Health Organization estimates that over 200 million girls and women have experienced some form of female genital mutilation before the age of 15. Female genital mutilation, also known as FGM, is a procedure in which the female genitalia are deliberately cut, injured, or altered. This practice is most common in the northeastern, western, and eastern regions of Africa, as well as some parts of Asia, and is believed to be carried out with the goal of discouraging a girl's sexual desires. FGM is typically performed by a traditional circumciser using a sharp instrument in unsanitary conditions, with serious health implications. It can be carried out from days after birth to puberty, and beyond, and in many cases, this procedure causes complications and infections that can lead to death or severe injury. Common complications include bleeding, bacterial infection, and urinary problems, among others. The victims of FGM are no longer the same after this traumatic experience, and sometimes suffer emotional difficulties throughout their lives, including depression, anxiety, nightmares, and other sleep problems. This is a harsh reality for millions of girls, but in today's world, there is thankfully awareness and efforts to eradicate this practice. A stronger focus on well-being and self-care, this form of punishment was both unusual and cruel, leaving a lasting impact on women's sense of self-esteem. Unlike the Iron Maiden, imagine being surrounded by cold steel for hours, knowing there is no escape. As terrifying as it may sound, the Iron Maiden was a medieval torture device that was designed to bring about a slow and painful death for its victims. It was a human-shaped box, decorated on the inside with incredibly sharp spikes, which would presumably impale the victim. On either side, when the box was closed, the spikes were not long enough to cause immediate death. Rather, they were short and placed in a way that would cause the victim to die a slow, agonizing death. Despite its terrifying reputation, the use of the Iron Maiden as a torture device on women has been considered a myth. Evidence of its actual use has never been found, though the Iron Maiden may stand as a symbol of horror in our minds. Women of medieval times feared it, and the practice of facial disfigurement starkly highlights the barbarism of that era. The assumption that a woman's value was based on her beauty was, and still is strong. That has made them a constant target of this punishment. The Central and later Middle Ages were periods of European history that saw a sharp increase in threatened and actual violence against the body. The judge has the right to punish women or men with facial disfigurement as punishment, most frequently in criminal cases such as theft or treason. Women found guilty of adultery are also subjected to this despicable treatment. In ancient Rome, cutting the faces of erring women was prevalent in Italy at the time. This sort of case was referred to as fro, which translates to both the act of slashing and the resulting scar. The most common cutting was to slice off the nose, a form of torture that was codified into English law in the 11th century during the reign of Canute. Recent archaeological evidence suggests that facial mutilation was used as a punishment much earlier than that. As we reflect on this dark chapter in history, facial disfigurement serves as a stark reminder of society's obsession with punishment. With regard to the issue of female beauty and the violence inflicted on women in order to maintain control over them, it has long been the order of the day. The motivation behind this practice was to coerce women into submission through the use of tools of horror, such as the ducking stool. The idea of using the ducking stool as a means of policing and silencing women has been around for a long time, longer than many people may realize. Throughout history, women have faced brutal punishment for simply being themselves, including being subjected to water torture on multiple occasions against their will. Between the mid-16th and early 19th centuries, an uncountable number of English women endured ducking as punishment for speaking out of turn or gossiping excessively. This was a ritualized practice in towns across England, with authorities keeping ducking stools readily available. These contraptions typically consisted of a wooden or iron chair attached to a beam, allowing the victim to be lowered into the water and raised out of it. These seesaw-like structures were often used frequently, although some communities cleverly stored them out of sight, ready to be moved to ponds or rivers at a moment's notice. Others proudly installed them in permanent waterside positions to be used when the need arose. Offenses were punished with ducking stools, which included adultery, prostitution, witchcraft, and being an unruly individual in society. Brewers of bad beer and bakers of bad bread also faced the possibility of being ducked. Local communities also used ducking stools as deterrents. If a woman was deemed disruptive or too unruly, she might wake up one day to find a ducking stool leaning against her door, placed there by local authorities. If this was hard to watch, you might not be able to eat your next meal after watching the stocks. Imagine visiting the market on a Saturday and spotting your neighbor pinned down by a plank at his feet in the market square, with a large D for drunkard perched on his head. A crowd would gather around him, watching in dismay. Around him, people were pelting him with tomatoes, adding to the chaos. Stocks were instruments of public embarrassment and humiliation. They were made of wooden or metal frames with footholes, used as a form of punishment until the beginning of the 19th century. These devices were used to restrain the offender's feet and hold their legs straight while people threw rotten vegetables at them. The punishment was meant to be public, and thus, the person in the stocks was almost always subjected to humiliation from people that lived in the area. This explains why stocks were typically located in marketplace areas. The condemned would wear a letter on their clothing to signify their crime. An adulterer would be marked with the letter A, a blasphemer with B, a thief with T, and a drunkard with D. In some cases, these letters were even branded onto the condemned person's face. One common reason why every town and village in England had stocks was solely due to this practice. The status of laborers, enacted in 1351, against unruly and vagrant women and drunkards. If a woman was found to be troublesome or if a worker refused to work, the resulting punishment was usually confinement to the stocks. This usually meant being confined to stocks by the feet or fingers, depending on the severity of the offense. Think of this punishment as degrading. What's worse, the pillory was an even higher level of punishment. The pillory was similar to the stocks, but instead of the head and arms being confined in the wooden frame, they were placed inside it. The pillar, a device used to punish, was a far more uncomfortable experience than stock. The reason for this was that a person had to bend forward in an extremely awkward position. Some offenders had their ears nailed to the board of the device and were often subjected to rotten tomatoes and buckets of blood being thrown at them. Sometimes, the missiles of choice were animal or human excrement. The pillar was designed to target well-known people in society, particularly women who were outspoken critics or branded as blasphemers. They often found themselves subjected to this form of humiliation. Weekends were typically chosen for these events, as they attracted larger crowds. What happened to the condemned person often depended on the mood of the onlookers, turning the event into a spectacle that people eagerly anticipated. Some victims were pelted with tomatoes, while others faced more brutal outcomes, with stones being thrown that could cause serious injury or even death. In the United States during the 18th century, individuals who were most frequently subjected to the pillory were slaves. These individuals were often fastened to the device and exposed to the crowd while being flogged. This torturous apparatus could be found in fields and barns throughout America. The pillory was a despicable means of punishment, but even more despicable was the gant. The gant, also known as the garrote, was recognized as one of the most brutal execution methods in history. It was specifically designed to inflict intense suffering and pain, often resulting in prolonged death, allowing the condemned to endure significant agony before finally succumbing. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the garrote was used in Spain as a method of delivering a merciful death to both men and women who had repented of their heresy during the Spanish Inquisition. Rather than burning them alive, the unrepentant were mercifully strangled with a sharp cord. A cruel and painful method of execution, which affected both men and women, was the garrote. The general theory behind it was that when the screw was tightened, it would crush the brainstem and kill the inmate instantly. However, if the screw missed the precise point where the brain met the spinal column, it would simply pierce the condemned's neck, while the iron collar strangled them. This method typically involved strangulation, which could prolong the victim's agony, as it often took a significant amount of time for them to die. The basic account of a garrote execution reveals that the victim was forced to lean back against an upright board while sitting on a stool. The executioner stood behind the victim and turned a long wooden bar to tighten the wooden collar until the victim's neck was broken. The collar was strengthened with iron or brass strips. When the collar was tightened, a large screw protruding from the backboard of some chair models would push into the spinal column. The cord of the hangman and the noose around his neck, but today, these ancient and inhumane methods have been relegated to the pages of history books. As we continue to grapple with our definitions of justice and mercy, the guillotine no longer claims lives, but its shadow lingers as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.